I had heard about the circle in Chatham County for years before I ever decided to go. The stories were never elaborate, never filled with ghosts or anything supernatural, but they carried a weight that made you think twice. People said it was a perfect circle, no plants grew in the center, and anyone who stayed too long reported strange things. Footprints around their tents, objects moved, a feeling of being watched that didn't go away. I wanted to see it for myself, not because I was brave exactly, but because I had a stubborn curiosity. I set out in the late afternoon, carrying a small pack with enough for a night in the woods. The weather was warm but crisp, that kind of late spring evening where the air smells like wet soil and pine. The directions I had were vague, just landmarks and a few warnings. The forest was thick, full of towering oaks and pines. The underbrush clawed at my legs, small branches snapping underfoot, and every so often I would hear a rustle that made me stop and listen. No one else was out here, I was sure of it. The circle itself wasn't visible until you were practically on top of it. I found it after following a narrow deer trail that opened into a clearing. At first, it didn't seem that strange. The circle was maybe 30 feet across, and it looked like the ground had been worn bare over time, but nothing particularly alarming about it. The edges were lined with tall grass and low shrubs, but the middle was just dirt, dry and cracked in some places, smooth and hard in others. I knelt down and brushed some soil between my fingers. It was fine, almost like the ground had been compacted by years of nothing growing on it. I set up my tent just on the edge of the circle, not wanting to be completely in the center. I unpacked my small stove and some food, trying to convince myself that it was just another camping spot. The sun was going down quickly, the woods taking on a heavy shadow that made the trees feel like walls around me. I lit a small lantern and ate quietly, listening to the birds settling in for the night. Everything seemed normal. By the time I crawled into my tent, the woods were dark enough that I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. The only sounds were the occasional snap of a branch and the whisper of wind through the trees. I thought I would sleep easily, but it wasn't long before I woke up. The clock on my phone read 3:07 a.m., though I hadn't set an alarm. I was lying on my sleeping bag, stiff from the cold, but I was wide awake. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but the feeling was immediate and strong. Something was different. I unzipped the tent quietly and peeked outside. The circle looked the same, empty and still, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw my pack and shoes neatly stacked at the edge of the circle. I hadn't done that. I knew it. My backpack, which I had left open with my gear spilling slightly, was arranged like someone had handled it carefully. My shoes were side by side, perfectly aligned. I froze. I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence. I stayed in the tent for what felt like minutes, just staring at the circle, trying to make sense of it. I told myself it could have been animals, raccoons maybe, moving things around, but the neatness, the alignment, it didn't fit. Raccoons or deer don't stack backpacks. I tried to sleep again, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined footsteps circling my tent, just out of sight, moving in the dirt and the leaves around me. I didn't hear anything real, but the air felt tight, heavy, like someone had pressed down on it. I waited for the first light of dawn, my nerves on edge, shivering not from the cold but from awareness. When the first gray light came through the trees, I got up carefully and stepped outside. The air was cool, fresh, and normal. The backpack and shoes were still where I saw them, perfectly stacked. I moved them back to where I had left them the night before and inspected the circle closely. There were footprints, small, human-shaped, faint, running clockwise along the outside of where my tent had been. The soil was dry, the prints fresh. I traced them with my fingers. They made a complete circle. I couldn't explain it. I knew the stories, but standing there with the prints in front of me, feeling the emptiness of the circle, I understood why people talked about being watched. It wasn't ghosts or spirits. It was something far simpler and stranger. Whoever or whatever had been here before me, it had a methodical way of observing, leaving its mark, making its presence felt without confrontation. I packed quickly, leaving everything exactly as it had been. I didn't dare linger, didn't eat breakfast, didn't try to understand. I left the circle behind, walking through the forest with my senses sharp, listening to every snap of a twig. The hike back to the trailhead was tense. Every rustle in the leaves, every shadow between trees made me flinch. But I didn't see anyone. There was no chase, no confrontation. Just an impression left on the mind, a trace of someone else's careful presence. When I finally reached my car, the relief hit me fully. I kept glancing back toward the forest, half expecting to see footprints following me beyond the tree line. But there was nothing, only the road stretching out ahead, the morning sun glinting off the asphalt, and the normal, predictable world returning slowly. I never went back. I haven't needed to. The experience stayed with me, not in a way that was terrifying in the usual sense, but as a quiet reminder that some places hold patterns and rules we don't fully understand. The circle isn't supernatural. It doesn't need to be. It's just a place that observes, that has had people notice it, that somehow shapes behavior without any direct force. I tell the story carefully, knowing most won't believe it. I don't mind. What matters is that I saw it, felt it, and left without trying to fight it. The circle will be there, always waiting for the next person to set up a tent, waiting for the next footprints to appear, perfectly neat, perfectly circular, and perfectly silent. And I know, after being there, that some places in the world don't need ghosts to be unsettling. They just need the quiet certainty that you are being watched, even when no one is around. I've hiked plenty of trails since then. I've camped in plenty of woods. But nothing has stayed in my mind like that circle. Nothing has made me so aware of the world around me. The way shadows fall, the way dirt can hold a message, the way human presence can feel so carefully noted without ever being acknowledged. That circle doesn't scare with monsters. It scares by proving that someone or something is always noticing, always mapping, always there, even when you don't see them. I never doubted the stories again, and I never went near that clearing, not because I was afraid of harm, but because I had learned the quietest lessons are often the most lasting. The circle in Chatham County wasn't cursed in the fairy tale sense. It was a reminder. Sometimes the woods themselves are the observers, and some patterns are impossible to ignore. I had been hiking in the Urals for days, moving slowly through the endless forests and snow-covered slopes. The snow was deep, wet in some places, powdery in others, and the wind had a sharp bite that cut through layers of clothing. I had hiked in harsh conditions before, but this part of the mountains had a strange quietness that felt almost unnatural. It wasn't just the cold, it was the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. Every time I stopped to look around, I could hear nothing but the crunch of snow under my boots and the occasional snap of a frozen branch. Our group had been 9 in total, all experienced hikers. We had planned this expedition for months, each of us carrying enough gear to last through a week of extreme conditions. The tent we carried was heavy duty, meant for high-altitude storms and deep snow, and we had all agreed to camp in a small clearing on a slope we had found after a long day of climbing. It was quiet there, surrounded by dense trees, snow falling gently on the branches. I remember setting the tent up carefully, making sure it was secure against the wind. The clearing seemed calm, untouched, and perfectly normal. That night, the air was cold even by Ural standards. I had layered up inside my sleeping bag, feeling the icy draft sneak in through the small gaps in the tent. Outside, the wind blew in soft gusts, and the snow made a dull, muffled sound as it landed on the ground. The smell of pine was strong and crisp, mixed with the faint scent of wet earth. Inside the tent, we were all quiet, resting after a long day. There was nothing unusual, no sound that made me tense. Then it happened. I don't remember what woke me, only that it was sudden. At first, I thought someone had fallen asleep and was moving around. The noise was soft at first, like something brushing against the tent fabric. Then it grew louder, more frantic. I could hear the others moving, voices muffled, panicked. But it wasn't normal panic. It wasn't the kind caused by wind or cold or hunger. There was urgency in their movements, a force that I can't explain. One by one, we all started tearing at the tent from the inside. We cut through the fabric, climbed out into the snow without our shoes, our jackets, some of us only in base layers. The cold hit immediately. It was brutal, but no one stopped. I remember looking around at the others. Some were barefoot. Some were wearing gloves, but nothing else. Their eyes wide, faces pale and frozen. The snow was deep, and our footprints scattered in all directions. Somehow, we all ran or stumbled or crawled into the forest, away from the tent. None of us knew where we were going. The next morning, the authorities found our campsite. The tent was torn open, but everything inside looked normal. Our packs were there, untouched. Food, gear, personal items, all exactly where we had left them. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of an avalanche or animal attack. But the bodies found in the surrounding forest told a different story. Some had broken ribs, others fractured skulls, and one even showed signs of radiation exposure. The injuries didn't match anything we could have caused ourselves in panic, nor did they match any predator attack that anyone could identify. It was as if we had been thrown against the trees and rocks by some invisible force. I don't know how to describe the feeling that night, the way fear can take hold of a person so completely that all reason disappears. One moment, you're wrapped up safely in your sleeping bag, and the next, you're cutting through canvas in desperation, running barefoot into a freezing forest. The cold bites your skin, your lungs burn, but something pushes you forward. You can't stop, you can't turn back. The forest swallows you up, and everything that seems familiar becomes distant and strange. The snow muffles your own screams, and the trees loom like silent watchers. For me, it didn't end in death. Somehow, I kept moving, keeping just enough control to avoid the rocks and hidden pits under the snow. My hands were bleeding from the cuts I had made to escape the tent, my face and feet numb from frostbite, but I kept going. I didn't understand what I was running from. There was nothing I could see, no animal, no person, no threat I could identify. Only the fear, only the compulsion to leave the campsite. I stumbled through the forest for hours, slipping and falling, my body screaming, my mind a blur. Eventually, I found a slope that led down to a frozen river. I collapsed near its edge, shivering violently, almost unable to move. The forest behind me was silent again, as if nothing had happened. I stayed there for hours, unable to stand, until I heard a distant noise. Voices calling, snow crunching under boots. Rescuers had been searching for us since the reports of missing hikers. When they found me, I was barely conscious, my clothing torn, and frostbite setting into my hands and feet. After that night, I could never explain why the others hadn't survived. Some had gotten lost in the darkness, others had succumbed to injuries or cold. No one could explain the broken bones, the skull fractures, or the radiation one of them had been exposed to. The autopsy reports left everyone puzzled. It wasn't a storm, an animal, or an avalanche. Something had frightened us so deeply that we fled into the forest in a state of panic we could not control. The memory of that night never leaves me. I can still hear the tearing of the tent, the desperate movements, the snow crunching under bare feet. I can still feel the cold that burned my skin and the fear that overwhelmed every thought. But the important part is survival. I made it through because I didn't stop moving, because I forced myself to keep going even when my body wanted to collapse. In the end, the forest let me live, and I crawled from the snow, broken and frozen, into the arms of those who had come to find us. I think about the others often. I remember their faces, their fear, their confusion. The campsite still haunts me in my dreams, calm and normal, untouched, as if nothing had happened at all. But I survived, and that survival taught me something I didn't understand fully at the time. Fear can control you completely, can make you act against your own sense, and yet, in the midst of chaos, a single decision to move, to not give in, can be the difference between life and death. Even now, years later, I would return to the Urals only with extreme caution. I know the mountains hold secrets, and I know what fear can make a person do. I don't know why it happened to us, and perhaps no one ever will, but I remember it vividly. The snow, the wind, the forest, the terror, and the desperate running. And I know I made it through because I never let the fear stop me completely. I escaped the forest, the slope, and the night that had taken my friends, and I walked out into the light of a new day, carrying their memory and the lesson that survival sometimes depends on the smallest acts of courage. The forest, after all, does not care. But if you respect it, if you move carefully and decisively, it may let you live to see the next sunrise. I had been hiking for hours, following a trail that led me away from the main roads and into a stretch of woods that seemed almost untouched. The sun was low, cutting through the trees in thin shafts of light, and the air was sharp with the smell of damp leaves and soil. My goal had been to explore the area around an old farmhouse that locals rarely spoke about, but everyone seemed to know. Hinterkaifeck, they called it. The name had a strange weight to it, a heaviness that pressed against the air as I moved closer. I didn't know much about the place, only that 6 members of a family had been brutally killed there, and that the forest surrounding it carried a reputation for being eerie, almost alive with the feeling of being watched. The path narrowed as I entered the denser part of the woods. Trees leaned over the trail, branches brushing my shoulders, and fallen leaves covered the ground so thoroughly that every step I took crunched loudly in the otherwise absolute quiet. I noticed small depressions in the soil, footprints that didn't belong to any animal I recognized. They weren't fresh, but the impressions were clear enough to make me pause. I squatted, studying them, running my fingers over the dirt. They were human, definitely, and they led deeper into the forest toward the farmhouse. When I finally reached the clearing where the farmhouse once stood, the structure was more ruin than building. Wood had rotted in places, shingles had fallen from the roof, and the small barn was half collapsed. The smell of earth and rot hung thick around the place, and every time the wind shifted, it seemed to carry a faint metallic tang that I couldn't place. I walked around the perimeter slowly, noticing the footprints continued from the forest to the edge of the house, stopping suddenly as if the person had vanished. I ran my hand over the fence post, rough and splintered, and shivered despite the mild air. I decided to circle the house, keeping my eyes on the tree-line. The further I went, the more I felt that eyes were on me, though I saw nothing moving. At first, it was just a whisper of a feeling, a tickle at the back of my neck, but as I moved, it grew heavier, like a weight pressing down from every shadow. The leaves rustled in ways that didn't match the wind, small twigs snapping where no branch had fallen. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, that it was just the forest playing tricks on me, but my stomach tightened with every step. The windows of the farmhouse were broken, jagged edges of glass still clinging to the frames. I crouched to look inside. Dust lay thick over every surface, and the floors sagged in the center. I could see remnants of the family's life scattered around. Old dishes in the sink, a chair tipped over, a broom laying in the corner. Nothing seemed moved for years, but the sense of disturbance was unmistakable, as if something had shattered the normal life of the place and left a shadow behind. I continued around to the back, stepping carefully over fallen beams and rotted boards. The barn was even worse. Half of its wall had fallen outward, and inside, the darkness was almost complete. I could see the outline of tools and machinery long abandoned. The smell here was stronger, iron-like, and it made me gag slightly. I realized that smell must have been the same people had described when they spoke of the murders long ago. The thought made my hair stand on end, and I took a step back. I stayed near the tree-line for the better part of an hour, moving slowly, carefully examining every shadow, every sound. The forest felt alive in a way I didn't like, almost as if it was breathing around me, holding its attention on my presence. I found more footprints, smaller ones that didn't match the size of the house's residence. Some went toward the house, others veered off into the woods. They were old, but clear enough to send a chill through me. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, the woods changed. Shadows lengthened, folding over themselves, and the temperature dropped sharply. I could see my breath misting in front of me, and every small sound seemed amplified. The distant snap of a branch, the rustle of a small animal, the whisper of leaves against each other. I realized that if anyone were still here, they could watch me from any of the countless hiding places the forest offered. My pulse quickened. I decided it was time to leave, but as I turned, I noticed something strange. In the dirt where I had been walking, there were new impressions. I hadn't felt anyone move near me, but the prints were unmistakable, deep and deliberate, leading away from the farmhouse. They didn't match my boots or anything I could imagine being left by an animal. My stomach sank. I felt a surge of panic. I didn't want to think about the history of the place, about what had happened here. I didn't want to imagine the Gruber family. 6 people killed by a pickaxe, the perpetrator never found, the killer possibly hiding in plain sight, watching from the treeline. I kept walking, moving faster now, trying to follow the path back toward the main road. My steps crunched loudly over leaves and broken branches, and I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone stepping out from the shadows. Nothing appeared, and yet the feeling persisted, a suffocating awareness that I wasn't alone. The footprints continued beside me, as if following, keeping pace without a sound. Eventually, I broke through the densest section of the forest into a more open area where the moonlight fell clearly over the trail. I stopped, panting, heart racing, and waited. Silence, heavy and absolute, filled the space. I looked back once more, and the treeline seemed empty, calm, as if it had been watching me but had decided I was not worth the trouble. The footprints I had noticed earlier were gone, erased by the wind or perhaps by whoever had left them. I continued on, slower this time, until I reached the edge of the woods near the road. The houses in the nearby village glowed warmly in the distance, and I felt a sense of relief that was almost painful. I paused there, looking back at the forest, and realized something important. The stories weren't legends, and the woods weren't haunted by ghosts. The danger wasn't supernatural. The danger was very real, grounded in human cruelty, and it could still be out there unseen, moving silently among the trees. Hinterkaifeck's horror didn't come from the dead. It came from the knowledge that someone had once walked these same paths, carrying a deadly intent, and had disappeared without a trace. I left the forest that night, walking the road carefully, never once turning my back. The experience stayed with me for days after. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves in the wind, set my nerves on edge. I thought about the footprints, the feeling of being watched, the house that had been the center of unimaginable violence. Hinterkaifeck was gone, only ruins remained, but the woods had a memory, and in a way, they still remembered. I never returned, and I warned anyone I knew to stay away. Some places I realized weren't dangerous because of what you could see. They were dangerous because of what you couldn't. By the time I reached my car, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, pale and gray. I felt exhausted but alive, with an understanding that some stories aren't told for thrills. They are warnings. Hinterkaifeck was one of those stories, a quiet, cruel warning hidden in the folds of the forest, and I carried it with me, a reminder that evil doesn't always make a sound, and it doesn't need an audience. It simply exists, waits, and sometimes watches, long after everyone else has gone. I had been planning the trip for months, studying maps and old colonial records, fascinated by the history of Roanoke. The idea of walking through the same forests that had swallowed an entire settlement in 1587 was both exciting and unnerving. I wanted to see the place for myself, to feel the isolation that must have gripped those early colonists when they vanished without a trace. I wasn't expecting to find anything supernatural. I'm not the type to believe in ghosts, but I wanted to understand the land, the woods, and the story that remained unsolved for centuries. I arrived early in the morning, the sun barely piercing through the thick canopy of pines and oaks. The forest floor was damp, still holding the chill from the night. Fallen leaves and broken branches crunched under my boots as I stepped off the old trail into the deeper parts of the woods. There was a narrow path, hardly noticeable, lined with moss and tangled roots. It felt like walking into another world, a place untouched by time. I carried a small backpack with water, a notebook, and a camera, but I kept my senses alert. Every sound, bird calls, the rustle of wind in the leaves, the snap of a twig, felt amplified, somehow heavier. After a couple of hours, I began noticing small signs that the area had been inhabited long ago. Arrowheads were scattered among the leaves, their edges dulled by centuries of exposure but still shaped with care. Some were jagged and crude, others finer, more precise. They were unlike any modern artifacts or even ones I had seen from local tribes in the region. I knelt and picked up one, examining the chipped stone in my hand. The edges felt sharp even now, and I could almost imagine the hands that had shaped it. I put it carefully into my pack. Deeper into the forest, the path vanished entirely, swallowed by undergrowth and uneven terrain. The trees grew closer together, their trunks thick and knotted. It was hard to tell which way I was heading, and I had to rely on my compass more than the map at this point. The air became heavier as I walked, humid and slightly earthy, carrying the smell of decaying leaves and damp soil. I noticed the tracks first. At first, I thought they were deer prints, but then I saw the way they were spaced, their shape slightly too human-like. They were narrow but long, the toes elongated in a way that no human or known animal could produce naturally. They led deeper into the thickest part of the forest, circling in patterns that made no sense. I followed cautiously, curiosity mixed with unease. By midday, the sun was higher, but the canopy blocked most of the light. Shadows draped across the forest floor like heavy blankets. I found a clearing and stopped to rest, sitting on a fallen log. The silence was oppressive. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I ate a small sandwich and drank water, keeping my eyes on the path I had come from. Even with the stillness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. There was a subtle shift in the air, a tension that made my skin crawl. I pressed on, eventually finding what appeared to be remnants of an old fort foundation. The stones were scattered and worn, some almost completely covered by moss and soil. It was easy to see why the colonists had chosen this spot, elevated enough for visibility, surrounded by thick trees for protection. But there were no signs of bodies, of tools, of life beyond what the forest had reclaimed. Only broken stone and soil. I walked among the ruins carefully, brushing away leaves and dirt. The word Croton didn't appear here, but the sense of abandonment was the same. I noticed more tracks, etched in the soft mud near a small stream. They didn't belong to any animal I knew, and they didn't match human footprints exactly. I followed them, feeling a strange compulsion to understand what they represented. As I walked, I found more artifacts. Pieces of pottery, a small rusted knife, fragments of what might have been clothing fastened with bone buttons. The items were scattered but intact enough to suggest that whoever had left them didn't do so casually. Someone or something had moved through this forest in ways that didn't match recorded history. Hours passed, and I realized I had wandered far from my original trail. The isolation became more pronounced. Sounds that had been distant were now close. The chirp of an insect, the scuttle of a small animal. Occasionally, a branch would snap as though under the weight of an invisible presence. I tried to remain rational, telling myself it was just the forest settling or small creatures moving through the leaves, but the sense of being watched wouldn't leave. As evening approached, I knew I needed to find my way back before dark. The forest transformed as shadows deepened. The air grew cooler, carrying a damp chill. I retraced my steps, marking trees and stones to ensure I wasn't going in circles. That's when I noticed something unusual, a small, crudely constructed circle of stones. In the center was a patch of disturbed earth, as if someone had dug and left. There were no signs of recent activity, no footprints leading to or from it, but the arrangement felt deliberate. It gave the impression of territory, a warning, or a marker left by something that had long disappeared. Night fell while I was still trying to find the main trail. I used my flashlight sparingly, trying to preserve my night vision, but the dense trees distorted the beam, casting long, twisted shadows that looked almost alive. I slowed my pace, aware of how easy it would be to trip or lose direction completely. The forest seemed to close in, the weight of centuries pressing down on me. Finally, after what felt like hours, I found a recognizable bend in the path. Relief washed over me, but I stayed cautious, moving slowly. The forest around me was quiet now, the earlier tension fading, but the artifacts, the tracks, the strange circle of stones remained vivid in my mind. By the time I emerged onto the main trail, The moon had risen, casting a silver glow over the trees. I looked back once, and the dense forest seemed ordinary again, but I knew better. The hike ended safely. I returned to my car, exhausted, muddy, and carrying more questions than answers. The forest had been real, tangible, and indifferent to human presence. The tracks, the artifacts, and the markers suggested that the settlers' disappearance could be explained by the land itself. Its isolation, its ability to hide evidence, and perhaps human or unknown activity in those woods long ago. The horror wasn't in ghosts or monsters. It was in the cold, hard fact that people could vanish completely, leaving almost nothing behind, swallowed by the complexity of nature and time. I left with a sense of awe and caution. The Roanoke Forest wasn't haunted by spirits. It was haunted by history, by the weight of human mystery. Walking through it, I understood how isolation, disorientation, and subtle threats could erase people from the world without a trace. I kept the arrowheads and pottery fragments I found, not as trophies, but as reminders that the forest still held secrets centuries old, and that sometimes the most terrifying thing is simply the unknown paths we cannot trace, and the permanence with which the land reclaims everything. By the time I reached my hotel, I felt a strange calm. The woods had tested me, shown me their hidden life and forgotten history. The Roanoke settlers had vanished, but the forest remained, patient, unmoved, and complete in its quiet mystery. I knew I could never fully understand what had happened, but I also knew that I had seen enough to respect the power of a place that could swallow people whole without leaving a single answer behind. The experience stayed with me, not as a ghost story, but as a profound reminder of how nature and history can intersect to create real, lasting terror, and how survival depends not only on skill, but on luck and understanding of the land itself. It was real, it was tangible, and I carried it with me. I never thought I'd find myself in Aokigahara, the forest at the base of Mount Fuji that everyone calls the Suicide Forest. I had always been drawn to quiet places, forests where the noise of the world seemed to vanish. But this place was different from any other I had been to. The moment I stepped onto the trail, the air seemed heavier, colder, and the usual sounds of birds and insects were muted, almost absent. The only thing that moved was the wind in the treetops, whispering faintly, and even that sounded muffled, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I had started early in the morning, carrying a small backpack with water, a camera, and some snacks. The trail was narrow, barely marked, and twisted through thick clusters of trees. The branches above created a ceiling that blocked much of the sunlight, making the forest feel like a dim indoor space. It was beautiful in a strange, oppressive way, but from the start, there was an unease that I couldn't shake. My feet crushed the pine needles on the ground, and every step echoed unnaturally in the quiet. The silence pressed down on me, and after a while, I began to notice other things. Small sounds that seemed too intentional to be random. The snap of a branch behind me when I hadn't moved, the faint brush of wind that felt like it followed my movements, the occasional thud on the ground that wasn't caused by anything I could see. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. I wandered deeper, sometimes veering off the main trail because it was easier to follow my curiosity than the poorly maintained markers. Then I started to notice the cold spots. The temperature dropped in patches, abrupt and sharp, as if invisible doors opened and closed around me. My breath formed small clouds, even though the sun was shining weakly through the canopy above. I thought I might be imagining it, but the difference was undeniable. The air felt heavier, almost wet in some areas and bone-chilling in others. At one point, I stopped to take a drink. I set my bottle down, and that's when I heard it. Faint, almost imperceptible whispers. They were in Japanese, I could tell by the sound of the words, but I didn't understand them. I froze. The wind was still, no leaves moving, no birds. I listened for a moment, hoping I had imagined it, but the whispering continued, soft and fleeting, as if it came from just beyond the trees. I glanced around, but there was nothing. The forest was dense, and yet I felt eyes on me, a sensation that made my skin prickle and my heart start to beat faster. I picked up my pack and moved quickly, forcing myself not to panic. The path began to curve tightly, and I found myself in a small clearing. I could see the trail continuing on the other side, but for a moment, I considered turning back. Something about the open space made the forest feel even heavier, as though the trees were pressing in, watching. That's when I noticed movement between the trunks. At first, I thought it was a deer or another animal, but it didn't behave like an animal. It was upright, pale, and distant, standing still. I blinked, and when I looked again, it had vanished. The clearing felt colder, the silence louder, and I realized I had been holding my breath. I kept moving, faster now, my legs carrying me through the thick undergrowth, roots snagging my shoes, branches scratching my arms. My mind was focused on reaching some part of the forest that felt less oppressive, any sign of human presence or the edge of the trees. Hours passed. I didn't know exactly how many. The sunlight shifted, faint beams cutting through the canopy, but the forest's interior remained dark. At some point, I realized my sense of direction was gone. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow seemed to hide something just out of reach. Eventually, I stopped by a small stream. The water was clear, running cold and fast over the rocks. I knelt and splashed some into my face, hoping to shake off the rising tension. I tried to calm my breathing, telling myself I was just tired, maybe stressed from the hike, and imagining things in the silence. But then I heard it again, steps. Not my own and not like the random sounds from before. These were deliberate, careful, echoing softly on the forest floor. My stomach dropped. I stood, slowly scanning the area, but the forest was thick and I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. I decided to follow the stream, hoping it would lead me to the edge. The sound of running water was comforting compared to the oppressive stillness of the trees. My pace quickened, almost jogging now, but the footsteps persisted, keeping pace with me, always just beyond what I could see. Every time I glanced behind, there was nothing, just the forest, thick and quiet, and the occasional swirl of leaves. My mind was on high alert, every nerve on edge. I realized the forest wasn't just quiet. It was patient. It let me think I was alone, but it responded to my presence in ways I couldn't explain. By late afternoon, the stream led me to a slope that finally gave way to thinner trees. Sunlight streamed down in a way that felt almost miraculous. Relief surged through me as I recognized familiar markers. A hiking sign, a faint dirt path that looked maintained. I ran the last few hundred meters, my shoes slipping on loose gravel, until I emerged on the edge of the forest. The air here was warmer, lighter, and smelled faintly of pine mixed with damp earth. I paused at the edge, leaning against a tree to catch my breath. I looked back at the dense mass of trees, shadows pooling between trunks, the way the forest seemed to continue endlessly, holding its secrets. I didn't know what I had experienced inside, whether the whispers were real, or if the figure I had seen had been someone else lost, someone who shouldn't have been there. I didn't want to know. I just felt a profound relief at leaving it behind, the oppressive weight lifting off my shoulders. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun was low in the sky. The forest behind me seemed distant and unreal, like a bad dream, but I knew it wasn't. The sensation of being watched, the sudden drops in temperature, the strange whispers, all of it stayed with me. I promised myself I would never return, and I haven't. The memory of that day in the suicide forest remains clear, not in a vague, mythic way, but in the small details. The way the needles muffled my footsteps, the cold patches of air, the figure that vanished between the trees, and the weight of a silence so complete it pressed against my chest. Even now, years later, when I see pictures of Aokigahara or hear people joke about it, I can still feel that quiet, suffocating pressure, the way it seems to follow you even after you're out. The forest doesn't need ghosts or monsters to be terrifying. It's terrifying because it doesn't care, because it isolates you completely, and because it makes you confront the fact that you are utterly alone, surrounded by beauty and stillness that can turn unbearable without warning. The memory is sharp, clear, and chilling, but at least I made it out. And that clarity, knowing I escaped something that could have trapped me forever, is the only thing that has ever made me feel alive in quite the same way again.